But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Italy? Whiskey? Ah, Italy! You could never unlock my secret. Oh no! Suddenly, hello, Libby!
Let's begin.
Indeed.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. Let me just adjust my camera a little bit because I'm off center. My name is Brian, and I am here with a very special guest, Edward Dutton. Should I call you doctor or just professor, or
call me Ed? Everybody calls me Ed.
Okay, we'll just say Ed. Okay, Edward Dutton, who has a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic. He's also written quite a number of books on various subjects, and he likes to talk about things that apparently a lot of the sort of mainstream establishment types don't like, and this is specifically why I wanted to talk to him. So welcome, Edward Dutton. Thank you for taking the time to come on our show.
Oh yes, thank you for having me. Pleased to meet you.
Yes, it's pleased to meet you too. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Why do you create these kinds of videos? What's your interest in these various subjects? You talk a lot about things like the sort of evolutionary backing for, female behavior, for the way that we organize our countries, our societies, etc. Why did you have an interest in this subject?
Well, I suppose it's two issues. One is a sort of autistic obsession with the truth. So I like to know the truth, and that's that. And I don't care if it offends people. And the other is the contrarian in me will react to being told that you shouldn't research something, that something is forbidden, that something is outrageous, by thinking, well, the very fact that you're saying that makes me think that there's something that you're hiding. There's some truth you don't want to be known. So probably if I'm a person that wants to know the truth, that is the very area that I should investigate. So I and my colleagues in the London Conference on Intelligence who research this, who are known for researching these kinds of things, find ourselves drawn to these controversial areas. I wouldn't have been interested in transsexuality until it became something that you weren't allowed to talk about and that you could lose your job for saying the wrong thing about. And then, of course, I became interested in it. And the same is true of feminism, the same is true of race, and the same is true of any of these other subjects. So if you want to know the truth, then you really have to go to the places where they are trying to suppress discussion.
Yes, absolutely. I agree 100%. It's basically telling you go here if you want to find the truth, because this is where no one wants you to go.
It's telling you if you're an uncooperative, difficult bastard, it's telling you go here. Yeah, that's and
yeah.
So that's what I find myself naturally doing, and that's what's happened with the issue of the issue that seems to be of concern to your channel, which is feminism.
Yes, we like to talk about men's issues, but more broadly, gender dynamics, the relationship between men and women, because we do think it's extremely crucial. It might be, in my mind, I have a theory that it's the most important issue of our time, and all of the other issues that we talk about, whether it's how we organize our governments, or the discussion around race and culture and religion, or the lack thereof. I think it comes down to the trust between men and women that has been eroded. And I think by feminism and those that support the ideas that feminism espouses. Does that make sense to you?
I certainly think that the rise of females and female empowerment has had a negative impact overall on the ability to discuss the truth and on science.
Yes.
Because men are the extreme male brain is obsessed with systematizing. It is basically autistic, and it is low in empathy. It doesn't care about feelings and trying to find out feelings and external signals of people's inner states and things like that. What's important is making sense of the world, and that is the essence of science. The extreme female brain is rather different from that. It is extremely good at empathizing. Empathy is really important. People's feelings are really important, but it is system blind. It is very low in systematizing. It is the opposite of the autistic. And this can be seen in the nature of men and women. Overall, women are higher than men in empathy. They're also higher in conscientiousness, so they are more rule following and they are more conformist. They are more concerned about the group and group dynamics and everybody getting along and everybody feeling happy. And therefore, they are more concerned about things like harm avoidance, and they're more concerned about things like equality. As they get involved, and they put, to the extent that many of them will put these things above the pursuit of truth and above systematizing. And what has happened with the entry of females into the university system is that they are appointed by men. In part, you have an evolutionary mismatch. Having women in the workplace is an evolutionary mismatch. In our past, women did women's work, men did men's work. There was some crossover to some extent, but that was basically it. So you'll get a situation where women are appointed to positions for sexual reasons, because of their sexuality, by all male academics, let's say. And who are you going to appoint if you are given two people? One, the person that was originally dominant at universities, the genius type. That person combines outlier high intelligence, which is also low among women. Female intelligence is a little bit lower than male intelligence, and it's also bunched towards the mean. Outlier high intelligence and moderately autistic traits, basically moderately low agreeableness and moderately low impulse control. The moderately low impulse control means that you can think outside the box. You're not a rule follower, and so therefore you can make original connections, which is what new knowledge is about. The low agreeableness means that, well, new knowledge always offends people. It always pisses people off. It offends vested interests. But if you're low in agreeableness, you either don't care about that, you're too autistic to realize you're doing it, or frankly, you quite like tickling them up. So this is the essence of the genius. This is where new knowledge comes from. And the women, and I look at this in a book I did with Bruce Charlton of Newcastle University called The Genius Famine. They're they're what we call the head girl. And we have in England at schools the head girl, what we call the sixth form. So when you're 17 or 18, that's the sixth form. And the person that is, you get prefects, and the head girl, the pupil that's given this honor of being the head girl. Maybe a little bit like what you have, the valedictorian, is it called, in America? Something like that. But they're not necessarily academically, they are academically very good, but they're also socially very good and things like this. And they get made the head girl. And those people, of course, are the opposite of a genius. They are intelligent, yes, but not outlier intelligent. They are high in agreeableness. They are high in conscientiousness. They are very socially skilled, and they are highly socially conformist. And what intelligent people tend to do is they tend to absorb better the dominant worldview. They tend to realize the social benefits of advocating it, and they tend to advocate it. And so they get on with everybody. That's the head girl. Now, who are you going to appoint? The autistic weirdo who might, as your colleague, who might do something good in the future, who knows? Or the beautiful, pretty head girl type? Who are you going to appoint? Well, the head girl. Yeah. And so obviously what we see is the takeover by departments, starting with the academically weaker departments like the humanities, but now it's moved on to sciences, of these head girl types. And once they get to only about a small percentage of the department, let's say 20%, they'll start A, appointing their own, and they'll start B, changing the dynamics of the university to fit with their own desires. And what their own desires are is conscientiousness, so that means everything's about bureaucracy and order and structure and basically kind of academic tidiness, like girls like, and empathy and feelings and speech codes and whatever. And these are repellent to the geniuses, so the geniuses get driven out of the universities. The geniuses stop being able to cope in the universities, they get sacked, and the culture of the university changes to being a place that is about knowledge and the pursuit of truth, to being really an extension of a kind of religion. Based around certain dogmas of empathy and harm avoidance. And that's what's happened. And we've now gone back. There was a situation where the universities were based around religion, Christianity, dogmas of group orientation and stuff like that. That was put above the truth. Then that started to decline as religion was questioned and so on. There was an optimum period, I think, of freedom between about, 1870 and 1990, something like that. And then you have the rise of women in academia, and now they've completely taken over. And they, along with simp men who've taken over academia, mean that now people that are genuinely brilliant and genius, they can't work in higher education in the West anymore. They have to go to Eastern Europe, or they have to go to third world countries, or they have to just be outside the university system. So I do think you're right that the rise of women has played a significant and negative role. And this was noticed even in about 1900, I think it was, when Oxford University first started to admit women. It was noticed immediately that it interfered with the cut and thrust of academic debate. A, because it meant that it was an evolutionary mismatch and men would be, driven by their cocks, would be trying to be nice to these women rather than academically debate them and whatever.
Yes.
But B, because you couldn't academically debate with these women and sort of engage in a disputation and pull their arguments apart logically, because it's just so mean.
Yes, of course.
And so they argued that it changed the entire culture of the university, and so they restricted the female representation of the university. They said that there can be no more than one woman for every 7 males. They restricted it because of that problem. So I think it has been very damaging to science for that reason. Yes,
so it's also harmed, you say, spirited, energetic, even aggressive debate, which is basically people fighting or arguing over what the truth is because we're trying to get to it. That's all been sort of taken a back seat to trying to get along, trying to conform, no fighting, no hurt feelings. But this means that you end up with a kind of velvet glove of authoritarianism anyway, because there are dogmas, there are things that you have to go along with in academia that you are not allowed to question. And they use this narrative of, let's not fight with our authoritative betters, like the professors that believe that gender doesn't exist or something like that. So is that like where we are? And this is from a long time ago?
That's also relevant. They are, I'm afraid, that, as we said, this difference between systematizing and empathy, they are less good at critical thinking than men. And so on average, I'm not saying it's always the case. Of course, there are women that are exceptions. And I would expect those women, by the way, to be relatively masculinized women. It was very interesting. Myself and some colleagues were at a conference at the University College London, and they had in the cafeteria this very politically correct exhibition of women who've made contributions to science. And you look at them and they were all ugly, man-like women. And that's of course what you would expect, because testosterone influences the nature of intelligence. People that are high in testosterone are more autistic in their intelligence profile. They are lower in linguistic intelligence, which is less G-loaded, and they are higher in mathematical intelligence, which is more what you need if you're going to be a scientist. And so, I think that this is what has gone on, and it's altered the nature of academia fundamentally. It's made it really into a kind of girls' game. And I think that's an important thing. Jordan Peterson is the person that coined that idea. That it's once something becomes a girls' game, then boys naturally don't like it, because boys traditionally have higher status than girls. Girls will love to be involved in boys' games. That's looked up to. That's considered, oh, you're a tomboy, isn't that good? But if you're a boy and you get involved in a girls' game, you're a sissy, and that's bad. And so, and there is that perception now at universities that to do a humanities degree, that's a girls' degree. To do particularly something like anthropology or sociology, that's for girls. And you can kind of write them off because they have no objective standards and they don't really matter. But what becomes a problem is when these girls start taking over serious academic science journals and rendering it a problem to be able to publish serious science on the grounds that it's offensive. You know, my colleague Noah Carl was peer reviewing for a journal recently, and one of the things that he was you're asked, is this a significant contribution to the field? Is it original? Could it cause offence? That was one of the questions that was asked by this serious scientific journal, and it shows you the influence. And this is the feminization of society, that something like this matters, and it shouldn't matter.
Yeah, so it's exactly this stuff that started in the humanities with these gender studies programs and so on. They've essentially taken the girls' game and spread it all over academia, and in most of the West too. So it's basically everywhere, and it's all about putting comfort, I guess, above the truth, which it can't go anywhere good, because the truth is going to hit you in the face eventually, right?
Yeah, and we should also note that women are more neurotic than men. So in terms of personality, they are higher in agreeableness, which makes sense, because that makes them better at it's like altruism, empathy, makes them better at looking after children. But they're also more mentally unstable. They feel negative feelings more strongly and suffer from depression and things like this more than men. And this can make them paranoid and make them feel these negative feelings very strongly. And I think this is the derivation of for example, there was a case in 2015 at Yale University where an email was sent round requesting that students not wear any Halloween costumes that other students might find offensive.
Yeah.
And an academic wrote in an email which went to basically everybody in response, saying, is this really the kind of thing that Yale University should be interfering with when our students are adults and whatever? And the result of that was that 200 students signed a letter asking for that academic to be sacked, and stating that they felt unsafe on campus. So this is the idea that you feel unsafe because people are expressing ideas that are different from yours. Why do you feel unsafe? Because you're high in empathy. If you're high in empathy, you're looking for signals of underlying states. And this makes you conspiratorial. This makes you, women are not higher in schizophrenia than men, but they're much higher in schizophrenia than they are in autism. Autism is a male disease. Schizophrenia is less conspicuously a male disease. And what schizophrenia is about is over empathy. And it makes you paranoid if you over empathize. You know, a slight little look like this might be that the person wants to kill you. And so the reaction to something like that among certain kinds of women would be, oh God, this is dangerous. There's this person, he must be some kind of evil Nazi. He doesn't agree that you shouldn't wear Red Indian costumes on Halloween or whatever. And so therefore you get this reaction. So it also creates a sort of this snowflake environment at university where some people are so sensitive that they need to have trigger warnings on, you know, the Bible, that there are images of death in it or whatever. So it just creates it is a terrible thing for science to have it. I'm not saying to have women in it, but to have women running it. And then it's not just, it gets you, it's more than that. Now they run entire countries. I mean, Finland is run by the Spice Girls, this group of 5 girls, all of them under the age of 40.
Really?
That's the government of Finland. The 5 girls under the age of 40. It wasn't until recently one of them had to resign for corruption reasons. So it's now 4 girls under the age of 40 and a man. So it's like the head girl government of Finland. And of course it means that women are now more educated than men, because what predicts doing well in education is intelligence. That's true, but it's more so conscientiousness. That's impulse control and rule following, and women are higher in impulse control and rule following, and so therefore they do better in the education system, and they make better sort of incrementalist academics, the sort of bog standard scientists that just do little incremental things as part of teams. But those are not the people that discover things and make major breakthroughs. And it's those people, they are very different psychologically, and it's those people that are basically driven out of universities increasingly.
That is all super fascinating. I didn't know that about Finland. I wanted to ask about a question about feminism. The question is, where do you think feminism came from evolutionarily speaking, because we know we can talk about the history of the movement and all that, but there was some kind of instinct or desire that started within our society that made it essentially tried to create this movement, right? So is there like some explanation as to why there are women and men who support these kinds of movements and where it might come from?
Well, the way I would sum it up is the fact that there is a weak correlation between extent of feminist identification and frequency and extent of rape fantasies.
Rape fantasies.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hear about that.
Let's look at what's going on. When you have very, very primitive societies where you are evolved to basically where it's a very easy society, so basic needs are met, but it's an unstable society prone to, there's dangerous animals all around you, you're in a jungle and there's outbreaks of disease and whatever. You are evolved to live fast and die young. You have to pass on your genes as quickly as possible. This means you invest most of your energy in sex, and you have as much sex with as many fit young women as you can, and you basically just love them and leave them. There's no point investing in any of the offspring because any one offspring that you have could be killed. So you go for what's called a fast life history strategy, and you just hope that some survive. We don't even hope, we didn't even think about it. You just have lots of sex. That's what you invest energy in. Sex.
Is that what we call our selection?
That's right. Our selection.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Very
okay.
little in nurture. Now, as the society becomes more stable and becomes harsher, then the carrying capacity for the species is reached, and members of the species start to compete with each other for limited resources. Now, in that context, if you simply have lots of children and don't invest anything in them, they could all just die of cold or just die. So so that means you invest less energy in sex, and you move energy away from sex, and you start investing it in nurture, both nurture of your female of your partner and nurture of your offspring, and you direct them towards a roadmap of life, which will mean that they will optimally survive. So you're investing less in sex. Now, that's the case. You're investing in the offspring. You're investing in your offspring as a man. Now, if you're investing in the offspring, you want to know they're your offspring. Mm-hmm. That's very important because in evolutionary terms, it's the worst thing possible to be cuckolded, to bring up another man's offspring as your own. That being the case, you want to be sure that your wife isn't sleeping around. Mm-hmm. Now, women, on the other hand, they're a bit different from men. They sexually select, men mainly sexually select for looks and beauty. A man can have sex as many times as he can get away with and invest nothing. A woman's got something to lose. What she can lose is she can get pregnant and she's encumbered with the child and whatever. Now, she and the child are more likely to survive if the partner is willing to and is able to invest in them. And so women, although they do sexually select for physical traits and strength and good looks and good genes and whatever, they select more for status, for socioeconomic status, and they are inclined to marry hypergamously, or as the Americans say, hypergamous. I can't pronounce it as the Americans do it. I say hypergamously, hypergamously, which is to marry up. Right. And so they will want a high status man. That's what they'll want, a high status man. But that high status man, he's investing his resources. He wants to be sure they're his kids. How can he do that? He controls the female sexuality. That's how he does it. How do you control the female sexuality? Well, you veil them, or you bind their feet, or whatever it is. All of these various strategies that are used to control female sexuality, and so that's the beginnings of patriarchy. Now, what you have, of course, as well, is the man wants to be sure the children are his, and so there's other men around and whatever. You're going to get lots of intermale conflict, lots of fighting. Because you're going to be jealous that your wife's sleeping around. That's no good. And it's no good in terms of what we call group selection, because you can pass on your genes directly by having children, but you can pass on your genes indirectly by helping your nephews and nieces, or your ethnic group, which is an extended genetic family, or whatever, right? And so it's been found that the group that is the highest in positive ethnocentrism, that is to say internal cooperation, getting along, and negative ethnocentrism, repelling the outsider, that tends to beat the other group in the context of group selection. Now, if you have patriarchy and the men are all sure that they're not being cuckolded, that's going to reduce intermale conflict, and it's going to mean that the group will be more likely to beat other groups and survive, and so on. So at the group level, there's a reason for patriarchy to be instituted, and at the individual level, there's a reason for men to select for markers of patriarchy. So men should be sexually attracted to women that indicate that they are submissive to the patriarchy, because those women will be less likely to cuckold them. And so therefore there'll be a selection for patriarchy and patriarchal traits in females, which is probably why agreeableness and conscientiousness in part are higher among females. Then we'll select for the markers of this. The best way, of course, for you to make people think you believe something is to actually believe it. So there will literally be selection for patriarchy. So what happens is that religiousness takes patriarchy and it makes it into the will of God so that it's more likely to be followed, and therefore women become religious, and therefore men sexually select for religious women, and therefore the women are more religious than men in most circumstances, and that's probably because of that kind of selection. And so this is where patriarchy comes from. It's basically women that have brought about patriarchy in order to get investment. They demand investment. The man says, right, if you want this investment, I want patriarchy. I want control of female sexuality. So that's where it comes from. And what would have happened over harsh Darwinian selection pressures that we were under until 1800 and the Industrial Revolution is there would have been very, very strong selection for group selection, firstly, because we were fighting other groups, and in more generally, selection for patriarchal women, and indeed selection for patriarchal men, for kind of benevolent sexists, because those are the kind of men that these women would find attractive. So that's where patriarchy comes from. So I hope that's a bit long-winded, but I think it is a necessarily complex explanation. And
no, yeah.
We can then move on. I mean, it's interesting actually. If you think about like porn, there's certain kinds of things in pornography that make it more arousing for men, and these are often things that indicate patriarchal submission. Women in maids' costumes,
nurses, and teachers,
French maids, indications of submission to a patriarchal system. I don't think that's irrelevant. I think that's relevant. Yeah. Anyway, with the Industrial Revolution, we have 50% child mortality, and every generation, any mutant genes that cause us to deviate from the genotype that is highly selected to this harsh yet stable environment are selected out every single generation. So that means poor immune system, every generation selected out, 50% child mortality. The brain is 84% of the genome, which means that if you've got mutations of the body, you've sure as damn it got mutations of the mind. And it's been shown that mutations of the mind correlate with mutations of the body, and people that have things like autism and schizophrenia and depression and all this, they correlate with poor physical health and poor genetic physical health. And so what you get with the collapse of Darwinian selection pressures is a build-up of these mutants, basically, of these this deviation from the genetic, the pre-industrial norm. So you get basically more and more and more individualists, more and more people who wouldn't survive in an environment that is really cold and really harsh, but they would survive earlier. They would survive back on the savannah where food is all around and basic needs are met and whatever. You basically get fast life history strategists. That's what these individualists are. They're selfish people. They're concerned about themselves. They're not concerned about the group. They live fast, die young. They're mentally, they're neurotic. They're low in agreeableness. They're low in conscientiousness. They're the people of the savannah. And you just get more and more and more of those people. That is what predicts being a feminist, being like that. And it's been shown that, of course, these women on the savannah, the level of sexual dimorphism is lower in these more primitive groups, because the men would just pump and dump. And so the women would be left to look after the children. And so they'd have to take on some of the masculine roles. And so the level of sexual dimorphism in these places is smaller than is the case among, for example, East Asians, where it's very, very high. Or Greenlandic people, they have the highest level of sexual dimorphism, the biggest difference between males and females. And so you start to get basically these more masculinized women. And it's been shown that being a masculinized woman correlates with being a feminist. Having masculinized hands correlates with feminist identification. Having masculinized personality correlates with feminist identification. Being sociosexual, i.e. high sex drive, that's a manly thing, that correlates with feminist identification.
What about lesbianism? Does that also?
I'll just look at a minute. So they are just extremely masculine women, to the extent that they're so masculinized that they fancy women. So they're just extreme butchers, extreme masculine women. Whereas a lot of women that might sort of play around with lesbianism a bit when they're at university or something, the femmes. They might be a bit masculinized. Maybe the heritability of female sexuality is like 10%. It's 10% or something. It's overwhelmingly environment. We can look at why that is in a minute. There's reasons for that. But anyway, and so you just get all these masculinized women, and of course they start, and then of course feminized men, because that's another deviation, individualistic sort of men. And this being individualistic, it correlates with being left wing. So people who are left wing are high in these individualistic values of harm avoidance and equality, these feminized values, and they are low in the group oriented values. And eventually they reach about 20% of the population, something like that. And then you get a tipping point, and everything tips over towards being individualistic. And that's what's happened. And so then you see the rise of feminism and the pressure of feminism on normal women, on women who would have survived under well, not those that would have survived, but women that are relatively genetically healthy. And this is interesting. This is then where it gets complicated, because then suddenly we talked about K selection and the need to be directed along the right roadmap of life, right? And this is very important because, of course, the more K-selected you are, the more environmentally sensitive you are. The more you need to be, you think about a very R-selected animal, like, I don't know, a
rabbits.
Yeah, rabbit. Yeah, it's born ready to fuck, isn't it? It's born ready to run around. It's born ready. Case with a more complicated animal, it needs to be nurtured. It literally needs to be nurtured by its family and by the group. Otherwise, it just can't cope, or it'll go very, very wrong. And so this is what you see, is that the people that are more environmentally sensitive, and this, by the way, includes women, because women are more K-oriented than men. Women are basically evolved to patriarchy. They're evolved to be told what to do by society, and particularly by their fathers and their mothers. This is what a Greek researcher called Menelaus Apostolou has noted, that women will make these bad decisions because they're not being told what to do correctly. So they will absorb not the adaptive ideology, which they used to absorb, of patriarchy and whatever, but they will be more, if there's a maladaptive ideology, if there's a bunch of what we call spiteful mutants telling you to do bad things, once those people reach a tipping point of power, then they will do it. They will really go for it. And that's what you see with these women. And so they take on not just feminism, but left-wing ideas and things like Extinction Rebellion, this environmentalist group, renouncing having children for the good of the planet.
Anti-human death cults.
Exactly. Precisely. Death cults. Go back to the 70s, Jim Jones and whatever. Exactly. I am waiting, and I'm sure it's going to happen in the next 10 years, for a woke death cult, a woke white woman death cult. It'll happen. It'll happen. It must do. And so this is, I think, what has happened. That's the essence. That's easy in a nutshell. And as for the men that support it, the men that support it are going to be just individualistic men who realize it's in their interests to conform to this stuff, and so convince themselves that they do support it. And that will be more intelligent people, because, as I say, intelligent people seem to be more better at norm mapping and convincing themselves of the veracity of whatever the dominant ideology is, and then involving themselves in an arms race to compete, to push it in an ever more extreme direction. So I think this is what's happened, and yeah, that's pretty much the situation.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused, so I want to ask you about this. So earlier in our conversation, you said that because you have to have a kind of a masculine brain to want to pursue the truth above people's feelings. And you talked about how you had known there were some women that, you know, they tended to be more masculine, a little bit, you know, not quite as attractive, not as feminine. But they were of the same, I guess you could say, the same caliber of person that your colleagues were in terms of their desire to pursue truth, despite whatever the consequences might be, the social consequences, and maybe they're more autistic. But at the same time, it appears that feminists are also more masculine brain. So are they like on that same? Are they masculine in that same way, or are they...
you're going to have variation within the population, and you're going to have some women who are masculinized in their thinking, and so all else being equal, they are going to be more logical. But with the feminists, it's not just that they're masculinized in their thinking, though that is an element of it. They are individualists. They are deviations from the norm. And so they're not just masculinized in their thinking. Having this ideology is going to predict being very high in mental illness, for example.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that later, but go ahead.
Mental illness interferes with the ability to think logically and to think rationally. Or they could be so masculinized in their thinking that they're very, very autistic, too autistic. Like an element of autism is good, but too autistic can be a problem, because it can mean that you approach the world as a sort of chaotic, hellish void, and you deal with this via a sort of a personality disorder where you convince yourself that you're better than everybody, and you become a narcissist, or you feel a fundamental sense of fear, and so you constantly take on new identities and don't really know who you are, and this results in you being, you know, very seriously mentally unwell and all the time. And so some of these women, yes, but they would perhaps have the appropriate balance, and I know people like that, but there's very few of them.
All right, and then another question is, if feminists and leftists generally are the product of a kind of, you know, they had this individualist thing about them, why is it that their goals tend to be so collectivist in terms of like forcing everyone to, you know, adopt their ideology and live the same way as they do, and their obsession with things like equality, and even like communism? Like how does their individualism lead to collectivist, authoritarian regimes, I guess?
Well, first of all, if they are individualists, then they are adapted to this unstable ecology. Therefore, they are high in mental instability, because this isn't selected out in that ecology, and you have to sort of live for the now. And so they are very fearful people. They approach the world as a frightening and unpleasant place. And so if it's a frightening and unpleasant place, then you want to control it, and you want to control everybody else, and you want to make them, you want to feel in control of them. And that makes the world less frightening for you if you're in control.
Yes.
Another negative feeling that you experience if you're high in neuroticism, if you're an individualist, you're going to experience feelings like bitterness and envy and whatever. And so you're going to have so you're therefore going to want to bring everybody down to your level, because you'll be bitter and envious that they have more than you, and your issue is you and how much you have. That's the only important thing, and therefore you will be attracted to socialist ideologies like communism, which are based around bitterness and envy and everybody having the same, or the kind of cultural communism that you have now. The third thing is that if you are mentally unstable, you will tend to have very low self-esteem, so you will identify with other groups, that you will see yourself as a perpetual outsider. The revolution is eternal. It doesn't matter how much power you have, you will always see yourself as low in power. It doesn't matter how much authority, it doesn't matter how safe you are, you will always see yourself as unsafe. And so therefore you will be in a perpetual fight for your own interests, but also you will identify with other groups that you see as like you excluded, as like you or low down the scale of life and unfairly treated. And so therefore you will identify with groups like that are of a different race, if it's a race that's considered to be poorer than you, or of a different sex or whatever. This leads to interesting contradictions in leftism, of course, because it means that on the one hand, as a leftist, you should be in favor of Jewish people and identify with Jewish people because they have been persecuted in the past and whatever, and so you should want to promote their interests, let's say. But on the other hand, you should be against imperialism and is what they're doing to the Palestinians in Israel, invading part of Jerusalem illegally, imperialist, so you should be in favor of the Palestinians, and so kind of
yeah, of course.
So you do get these kinds of contradictions. Like, for example, race is an interesting one. You should be in favor of the interests of other races that are not white because they are marginalized, and so therefore you should argue that race is a social construct because it is these evil nationalists and Nazis and evil race scientists and whatever, these bad people that argue that race is biological, and so therefore race is a social construct. Oh, except race is a biological construct for when it is necessary to get donor organs for people that aren't white, living in white countries, and there aren't enough of them. Oh, well, then suddenly it becomes a biological construct for that moment in time, and then it goes back to being a social construct again. But that doesn't matter if you're low in systematizing and high in empathy, which is, of course, true of a lot of women and who can be better indoctrinated with these things. And it doesn't matter if you're an individualist because you don't care about the truth, because these moral foundations of harm avoidance and basically your own power come way above the truth. And so the truth doesn't matter.
Right. So it's almost like this isn't, it may appear to be collectivist, but it's really just narcissistic. It's about control.
Well, yes, indeed, there is evidence that there was a study that was done on this that was found that being far left is correlated with being Machiavellian, which makes, power hungry, which makes sense with regard to what I was saying earlier about a need to control the world if you're neurotic, and with narcissistic, which makes sense because such people are fundamentally insecure and they need to be loved, and so if you're signal left-wingness in the current environment anyway, you people will love you more. Mm-hmm. Whereas being right-wing, being alt-right, that being a white nationalist, that was associated with being high in psychopathology. And that to me makes sense because if you are of that persuasion at the moment, then basically you're going to be pissing people off and you're going to have to enjoy doing so. You're going to have to quite like chaos because you're basically throwing yourself into a world of danger. And so you can see how that would be attractive to some people like that. So, so that's the essence of it, that people that are group-oriented are so group-oriented that these moral foundations of Jonathan Haidt, 5 moral foundations, obedience to authority, in-group loyalty, and sanctity versus disgust. And then there's the individualizing, those are the group foundations, and then the individualizing foundations are harm avoidance and equality. And it's been found that the right, people that are right-wing, are about equal in all of the 5 of those, and people that are left-wing are very low in the first 3 and very high in the last 2, i.e. in the individualizing foundations. And so this, of course, means that there is asymmetric ability to empathize, that the right can empathize with the left's concerns, but the left can't empathize with the right's concerns, which means that things will tend to get pushed in a left-wing direction. People will always cede ground to the left. In still doing so creates this dysphoria for so many people because the group binding foundation is not attended to, and then you get a right-wing backlash, as happened in, let's say, the 80s. But the people that are group-oriented, they're the genuinely nice people. And that's demonstrated in the fact that people that are conservative are higher in agreeableness and conscientiousness than people that are liberal. They are lower in agreeableness and conscientiousness. So they're selfish people. And people that are very group oriented will lay down their lives for their group. I mean, they're so selfless they die.
So this is the difference between, say, people who are more likely to donate to charity because they're trying to genuinely help people, and people who virtue signal, right? Yeah, exactly, precisely. I mean, this is one of the things that Jesus
of all people, who talked about the person that gives money to be seen to do so. And that's what most of the left do. They give, they're Pharisees and whatever, they give money, they are holy to be seen to be holy, rather than, to be holy in itself. That's another interesting thing, which is that being a conservative religious person, being genuinely religious, is associated with low neuroticism. So people that are religious are low in mental illness, whereas people that are in religious environments that are high in extrinsic religiousness, so that is predicted by mental illness. People that are high in extrinsic religiousness, that want you to know they're religious. And so you can see that in an environment where the dominant values are not the group values of traditional religion, but are these individualizing values, it's going to be people that are mentally unstable that are going to want you to know that they're religious, and that are going to heavily signal it, because they are going to be insecure about not being seen as religious, because they're going to be insecure about controlling people and all this sort of thing. So basically, the people that go on the most about how important it is to help the environment, to help Black people, to help gay people, are likely the most Machiavellian, selfish, nasty people you could ever meet.
Okay, so I want to say something about feminism that we often talk about on the show and get your thoughts on this. So feminists always claim that what they're fighting against is they're fighting against the patriarchy, and their definition of the patriarchy is essentially a system created by men to the benefit of men and at the expense of women, and it was basically made to oppress them. Now, of course, I've seen your videos about why patriarchy is good for women. But the thing I'm wondering about is that I find interesting is that when you really break down what feminists are asking for, what they always try to get done usually through the state, usually through the government, is essentially simply substituting the role that a man had before, which was to protect and provide for women. It just replaces him with the government. But the government is still taking money from men, as men make up the majority of taxpayers, and most of men's money that is taxed from them goes into the welfare system, which in turn goes to women. So they really haven't changed anything. In fact, we believe that feminists really like patriarchy. They just don't like that men have it may have historically given them authority over women, while also making them responsible for women. But now men are responsible for women, but they are not supposed to have any authority over women. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, you could argue that they are slightly less responsible for women, in so much as it used to be the case, for example, in England, that if a woman got into debt and she was that wasn't her responsibility.
Oh, that a man had to pay off her debt. That's why it was harder for women to get credit.
If a woman committed a crime, it was possible for the man also to be indicted for it, because it was assumed she'd be acting under his instruction. So that there were, and I could list others, there were certain negative sides for men to a very strictly patriarchal system. You are right. There is an extent to which the state takes on, to some extent, takes on some of these roles. But on the other hand, I mean, they are being taught things that are palpably wrong about the way of the world, and these have serious consequences. For example, there's a woman recently in England called Sarah Everard. She was 33 years old. She went to the same university I did, actually, Durham University. It's a sort of posh university.
That's the woman that was killed by the cop, right?
That's right. Well,
yes.
But possibly, yeah. And
okay.
She was wandering around in the dark late at night on Clapham Common. Now, I wouldn't wander around in the dark late at night on Clapham Common. I'm a 40-year-old man.
Yes.
But she was doing that. And she had, it seems to me, absorbed all of these messages of feminism, that men and women are equal, and you have your rights, and it's okay to be 33 and single and living in London and enjoying your individuality and getting to know yourself, and wandering around at night in the dark on Clapham Common. And she died because of that. She basically died because of feminism. She's a victim of feminism. That's how I see it. So there are many negative dimensions to this feminism for women. Another problem with it is it means that they often end up, a lot of women want to have children, but they also have a deep drive to marry hypergamously, to marry up. And that drive is so strong that in England, in World War I, about 8% of those that went out to fight were killed, but it was about 12% of the officers. And the officers were overwhelmingly upper class and upper middle class. So it meant that there was a significant shortage of upper class and upper middle class men. And women were so repelled by the idea of marrying down, of marrying someone of a lower status or even the same status as them or as their fathers, that they just didn't marry. And so you had this generation of just childless spinsters who couldn't find a husband. In my own family, there were such women. And you have this now via another means, which is that women are more educated than men. Women are, apart from exceptions at the extremes, due to the fact that their intelligence level is not that much lower, and due to the fact that their personality traits are more pro-social, they're higher in general factor of personality, which predicts socioeconomic status, of the same, if not higher status than men. And so this means that if you are a middle-class woman, there's just not enough men. There's not enough men. And so the result of that is that you don't have children. And indeed, you talked earlier about lesbianism. You take up lesbianism. That's one of the phenomena that's noticed, that these women that about 40, they give up on having on having children or whatever, or maybe they have child via IVF, but there's all kinds of problems involved there.
Aren't women more prone to have a more flexible sexuality?
Yes, exactly.
I've heard that, but
there's good reasons for that. One reason would be that until relatively recently in human history, we were polygamous, and the women would, of course, sexually select for status. And so if they could, you just have lots of them marrying a very high status man. And that high status man is going to, of course, invest most of his resources in the wife that is the newest wife, that is the most nubile and whatever. And so the wives that are a bit down the pecking order are going to just, will in order to survive, will end up, and for their offspring to survive, will end up engaging in what's called alloparenting, where they sort of lesbianiciously get together and co-parent each other's children.
So it's kind of like where we get harems and concubines.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why you get so many women that become gay in all-female environments, like prisons. It's an inbuilt evolutionary thing. I think there was some research that it was more than half of women that have been through the prison system have gone through a little gay phase. So that's where that comes from. So that's another negative side to it. Another negative side to it is that women don't like it. I mean, women when you actually do research on it, they want and they like and they're attracted to benevolently sexist men, and they want to be looked after by such men. That's what they want. And so they are in an evolutionary mismatch by virtue of having to go to work, and they don't like it, and they vote with their feet. They retire earlier if they can. They take time out of doing so. They go part-time to create a work-life balance. That's with their kids and whatever. That's what they want. And they're in an evolutionary mismatch, and that creates dysphoria, and that creates depression, and that creates not wanting children, and it creates maladaptive behaviors and ultimately suicide. And so, which also women are considerably higher in because they're more prone to depression as well. And so there's all kinds of bad sides to this. It is not good to be in an evolutionary mismatch. And this is an extreme evolutionary mismatch for both women and men. But women are more environmentally sensitive. Remember, that's the thing. Women are more environmentally sensitive. So an evolutionary mismatch is worse for them. It is more important for them to be directed along the evolutionarily adaptive roadmap of life than it is for men. Men are basically more instinctive.
Okay, next question. I want to talk about testosterone. So there has been a noted decline in testosterone levels in both men and women, and I think it's at a very low point. I don't know if it's the lowest, but And I wanted to know, like, because even women, you know, they have testosterone. It's nowhere near the amount that men have, but I think it's allowed us to basically be able to endure hard times, you know, years ago, like when we would have to survive the elements and homestead and, you know, work like all day to provide for our families, etc. So do you know why there is a decline? And what does this do for both men and women, and how can we you know, preserve it or try to build it back up?
I haven't seen research indicating a significant decline among women. Can you send me the link to that?
Yeah, I can find it. Allison has talked about it.
We don't know why there is a decline. It's a very dramatic, steep decline, and it's happened since about the 70s. So something's going on. I think it could be partly dysgenics playing out. So we are more genetically sick than we used to be. If you're more genetically sick, you are unable to produce as much testosterone. That could be one thing. You're more likely to have things, mental illness, depression, which elevates cortisol rather than testosterone. That's another thing. So that it could be partly that playing out. Among men, it could be that they are put in this evolutionary mismatch, this dysphoria, where they are discouraged from, you know, this life is now a girl's game at school. Nobody wins or loses. It's been found that winning, you've got to win and know you've won, and that elevates testosterone. And that's a problem now in an environment that is no longer male run, it's female run, and everybody has to be equal and whatever, and there's much less obvious competition and winning of competition. So that's going to reduce testosterone among men, because the evolutionary mismatch and the dysphoria that brings about is going to reduce testosterone among men. And there is this idea that of endocrine disruptors in certain kinds of plastic, which could be relevant, which also, if that's the case, would reduce testosterone among men and women. And so that we don't know what's going on. It's quite a serious thing, though, because if it carries on like this, then eventually nobody will have a sex drive at all. But and it is, I should stress, these studies control for age. We are an aging population, and testosterone peaks at a certain age and then goes down. But these control for age. So as age control and producing less semen as well is a fact. The semen production has fallen by 2/3, controlling for age among men since 1973. That's a dramatic drop. So I imagine it's the conflation of all of these different factors.
Yeah, I think that it's also, you know, we don't do as much. Like I said, our lives have become very comfortable.
Oh, that's also true. I think that some of the studies controlled for obesity, so they only used people that were otherwise healthy. But that's also true. Yeah, if you're physically inactive, then you produce less testosterone. That's also true.
Is there a correlation between having autism and having a high testosterone? Since I think that you basically said that autism is a sign of being extremely masculine brained, and that there is
autism. Yes, autism correlates. Autism is the extreme male brain, and it correlates with testosterone. Yes.
Yeah. So, but we've only been, at least I've only heard of autism as a phenomenon relatively recently, as something that we discussed. And we do have a tendency in schools, when boys are in schools, for example, and they misbehave, or they get distracted, or they're not able to focus, because schools are run in a feminine way, under a feminine model to benefit girls. Most of the instructors, they don't know how to handle boys. We don't have recess anymore. I think that gym classes, and you said, competition is discouraged, so boys don't have an outlet. There are do you know what recess is? Do you guys have that in the UK?
Playtime.
Yeah, playtime. Yeah, we don't have those in our schools anymore. I mean, there are some places that still do, but because there was a concern that it would essentially result in things like bullying and I know it's basically it's boyish behavior would normally be encouraged, right? So they didn't want any of that.
There was a poem, I forget what it was called, who wrote it, but there was a poem in the 80s I remember being read called "The Killing Ground."
Yeah.
which was about the playground. I mean, it does, of course it does, because the kids are in charge. So it's like Lord of the Flies. But the thing is that prepares you for life. It prepares you and gives you strategies to deal with bad things that will happen to you in life. And if that never happens, then if you never experience any adversity, then when adversity does happen, you'll be completely unprepared for it. And that's what you see with these snowflakes. That's why they find someone expressing an opinion they don't like, making them feel physically unsafe because they've never been unsafe. Good heavens.
Yeah,
anyway,
and in addition, recess is good because boys have more energy, and so like you want to get the energy out of them, and then they come back to class and they're they've done a lot of running around and playing, and
like children being diagnosed with autism, children running
ADHD
because there's a loud noise, ADHD, the inability to sit down, and it never occurs to them that if there was, when I was a boy in the 1980s, these things were not recognized. There was no ADHD, there was no autism, and if you engaged in the antisocial behavior patterns that are, you may have had these things. But if you wouldn't dare express the pathologies associated with it, otherwise they'd hit you. Or at the very least, they'd make you stand in the corner with your hands on your head till it really hurt, or something like that. And so therefore you behaved yourself. If you take away basically the fear, an element of authority is fear. If you take away the fear element, then you're going to just get children playing up and they can't do anything about it and they'll disrupt the lesson. And so you end up, oh, they have ADHD, or they have autism, or they have to go to a special school or whatever. It's ridiculous. It's just bad teaching. And it's the feminization of education. They used to have such a rule that boys would be taught by male teachers. That was how it worked. Girls were taught by female teachers, boys were taught by male teachers.
Is that really how they did it? I didn't know that.
Not when I was, when I was at, if you go back 120 years, something like that, that's how it operated. Education, boys' schools and girls' schools, completely separate. By the time I was at school, the primary school, what you call the elementary school, that was mixed. But the better secondary schools, the secondary schools that were regarded as, they honestly got better results, were sex single, boys' schools and girls' schools. And the vast majority of the teachers at my school were men, at my secondary school. At the primary school, only the headmaster was a man. But and now it's women. They make up like something like 80% of primary school teachers, and something like 65% of secondary school teachers. It's absolutely ludicrous. And then even at university level, they dominate the humanities and the social sciences. So it's just feminization that has caused this problem. There'd be no ADHD if children feared their teachers. That's for sure.
Yeah, that, and it's also in one of the ways that the school system ensures that most teachers are women, and this all goes all the way to the beginning to daycare, is they essentially create, they have this narrative of men as dangerous, as pedophilic, right, and a threat to children. So men that even want to teach won't go into the field because there is this sort of narrative.
I did a book on this actually a while ago, called Churchill's Headmaster: The Sadist Nearly Saved the British Empire. And I'm sure a lot of these people may have had pederastic inclinations, but they didn't act on them. But it motivated them to want to teach children. And there was a judge actually in the UK who said there was some case where some male school teacher had been done for looking at child porn or something, or I don't know what it was. And she said that many men that go into teaching are sexually attracted to children, but they control those impulses, and you have failed to do so. And the predictable outrage from the teaching union saying, how dare she say this? Men do not go into teaching because they're sexually attracted to children. Of course they do. Why else would you want to spend loads of your life with other people's young boys, for God's sake? As long as you don't act on it. But anyway, yes, it is. But it has a clear problem. Also, I did this study in the journal Medical Hypotheses, where we show that if you control for all of the confounds, like the genetic confounds and things like this, then corporal punishment, moderate corporal punishment, has positive effects. And I would imagine that the withdrawal of that, you still have it at some schools in America, I believe, in the South. But the withdrawal of that from schools is, particularly for boys, who are going to be more psychopathic than girls and therefore basically motivated by fear and nothing else. It would have severe negative effects on teaching.
Yeah, well, to add on to what you were saying about the pedophilia thing, this is actually it's interesting because most of the cases that we see, no, I haven't really seen any of the opposite, although I'm sure it probably happens somewhere. There is a big problem with female teachers preying on their male students, and it happens all the time. They call them affairs or whatever, but this is a problem, and people don't seem to see it as the same kind of problem as as if the genders would be reversed.
Well, no, because it's every child's fantasy, isn't it? I mean, say what you like. When I was at school, there were these two teachers that everyone, all boys school, and there were these two teachers that everyone fancied, And I remember there was a French teacher. She was about, I don't know, 25 years old. We were about 13, and this boy would sit. We'd sit in rows of two, and when she came to help you, she'd come between you and the person you were next to and bend over the desk like that to look at your book. And so you'd say, you'd say, no comprenez, madame. And she'd come over, and these friends behind me would say to me, Ed, please say that you don't understand this so she can come over and bend over so you can get under their ass. That was so she must have known. She wasn't stupid. But yeah, of course, there was an episode of South Park, wasn't there, where Kyle's younger brother, who's about 4, is meant to be having an affair with the nursery teacher, and he goes and tells the police, and the police says, well, okay, yeah, we'll go and get your brother, and give him the luckiest boy in America award.
Yeah.
So yes.
I mean, like I still think it's harmful. Even if boys fantasize about it, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they should get. But it's interesting that we do, treat it so differently.
It's another mismatch, isn't it? It's another mismatch. Well, there we go. It's because it is good for men. Men is being sexually virile. That's what we're adapted to be promiscuous, to get any sex where we can get it, because women are more picky than us and whatever. Yeah. And so you can see why whereas women, it's completely the reverse, which is why, rape as a concept exists. So it is an evolutionary mismatch. School, I think, really is a kind of rite of passage. That's what it is. It's the rite of passage. It's a big part of it. It's a rite of passage where you're inculcated with the ideas of the society and with useful knowledge. Now, traditionally, that only happened to boys, and the instructors were men. And the idea that there'd be women instructors would be just among
I think it is a product of that mismatch.
It's a silly thing to happen, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, for sure. I think that is the reason why it is a product of us treating the genders as though they should be able to essentially just work with each other under all circumstances, no matter the age difference, no matter what, because some of these teachers, they're not attractive. Like they're very unattractive, and they prey on boys. Actually, feminists have often written about boys. I think Germaine Greer. No, I might be thinking about Andrea Dworkin, who had written. Yes, no, not at all.
My new book my book on feminism, which is coming out quite soon, which is Feminism and the Fall of the West. I have a whole chapter on Andrea Dworkin and her. She's basically a modern day witch.
Yeah, but she's also written about her sexual attraction to young boys. So there is something, you were talking.
That would make sense though if you were a fast life history strategist that was evolved to, live fast and die young. And I return to what I was saying earlier. Why would you have rape fantasies in that environment? Exactly. If you're a feminist. Why? Because you are evolved to a situation where the man's not going to invest. The man will pump and dump and leave you. That's what fast life strategy is about. And so all you want is to make sure that your offspring is physically good, physically tough, such that they can survive in this unstable ecology. The only way you can be sure of that is it's an absolute alpha dominant, violent, but muscular man that fertilizes you. And the only way you could ensure that is by constructing basically a shit test, is by basically throwing everything you can at him and fighting him off. And if he manages to get through your defenses, then he's the man for you. So that's why they have these rape fantasies. That's why women have rape fantasies. And that's why you would expect, I mean, if you think about it, the essence of fertilizing a female is that the semen, 500 million spermatozoa are produced. Everything of the woman's immune system, the vaginal mucus, white blood cell, everything is thrown at them to kill them, as though they are rape. And then finally, the one alpha sperm gets through. It's not a romantic scene like in Look Who's Talking or something.
Yeah, sure.
And so you can see why a feminist would have fantasies like that. And I think it's obvious that Andrea Dworkin did have rape fantasies, one of which was so intense that she thought it was real. She wrote about this. And by the way, it was a rape fantasy with a much younger man. Because the semen quality is the only thing you're going to be interested in. It's no good having semen from an old man in a context like that. It's going to have mutations and things. You want semen from a man who's about 25. That's what you want. That's the best quality semen.
Yeah. Feminists do. They in particular have rape fantasies, and I think it's one of the reasons why they discuss and often try to essentially paint masculinity itself as toxic and rapey. It's because I think that they are probably some of the most submissive women. But that's just my theory, because I've seen it demonstrated in my personal experience with feminist women. They tended to be that
submissive way. Once it is clear that the person is an alpha type male, I would think that would
not sense. To male feminists, right? No. They actually find them pretty disgusting.
That's what I mean. They would be, well, ultimately, I suspect, and this is why you'd get these tensions over it. They'd be very sexually attracted to benevolent, sexist men, to the very kind of people whom they condemn, and that would make a great deal of sense. And I would see feminism as a reversal to as what's known as the colloquial as the shit test. So basically what you're doing with feminism is you're creating an extreme evolutionary mismatch for men. You're creating an absolutely terrible environment for men. An environment for men that indoctrinates them into being women, that makes them feel depressed and dysphoric and whatever. And the only people that are going to get through that are the men with basically the best genes. The men who, despite being told you're rubbish, you're awful, toxic masculinity, don't have children, whiteness is bad, all that stuff. The men that still, after all that abuse, are inclined to want to have children, still, they get through this. And so I think I would see that as the equivalent of a female, fighting off the dominant man to the last moment. It's a way of removing the weaker men, such that
or her immune system trying to fight off all of his sperm. And the one that gets through, exactly. That's a really interesting metaphor. Okay, so we've gone a little over, but there is something else I want to ask you about, and then I'll take a couple of the super chats. Number one, you made a video, I believe, that compared autistics. Basically explain how autistic people are more likely to be interested in libertarianism and sort of like right-wing political affiliation. So people who are more masculine tend to be on the right. And I saw this article that was put out by a website called EV Magazine, which is a conservative woman's website. And it had an article entitled, "Why do over 50% of liberal white women under 30 have a mental health issue?" And I've seen other things that were written that had talked about how leftism, and I know that I'm getting a little bit politically partisan for those guys who are watching, but there are trends and patterns that I'm observing. It's not, I'm not making a moral judgment of either sort of political affiliation, but rather observing the patterns that I've seen, that leftism tends to be feminine and that being right-wing tends to be masculine. Do you does that make sense to you, or do you think that that's an oversimplification?
Well, if you say the word tends to be, then it's not an oversimplification. It's
No.
inherently not an oversimplification. So it does make sense to me, yes, because leftist values are basically, to the extent that they're genuinely meant, rather than being virtue signaled about, they are harm avoidance and equality, and those are what women are interested in. And right-wing values are things like structure and order.
And
equality,
hierarchies, like vertical hierarchies
hierarchy.
as opposed to, say, horizontal hierarchies.
And putting the good of the group, and not really caring about the feelings of the individual, and that is a male thing. So yes, in that sense, yes, I agree.
Okay, and then like, so this is
there's nuances to that can happen, though.
yes.
So, for example, if you have a very right-wing society, then you would expect women to absorb that better and to start right-wing signaling. And also, if the religion was a traditional religion that was then right-wing, women are more religious, and so they would end up perhaps being more right-wing than men.
Like
Which was the case until the 60s. It was
like
the case.
well, in Islam it's like that. I think in Islamic countries where Islam is the dominant religion and it's also the government, the women are they can be as or more religious than the men, and they'll raise their children in the same sort of, to sort of go along with that structure, right?
In England, in Victorian England, that's what you had there, that it was a right-wing conservative society, and the stormtroopers of that were the spinster ladies, or the women anyway. And so you would expect that to reverse in a left-wing society. I mean, the women were the stormtroopers of Protestantism. I mean, the women were the of these kinds of things. But so there's that nuance. But if you take away those elements, then you would expect, so women can be sort of expressive of their natural inclination. If you take away the religion element, basically, then which has happened now, then what comes out is their general empathy and lack of patriotism, and that's what you get.
Yeah. And I think the reason why you get those changes you were talking about is women tend to value security over liberty, because they don't feel if they don't feel safe, then they don't feel free. Men they value liberty over security. They feel that they can provide their own security and that they don't need the state to do that, which is where usually security comes from when people are asking for it. So if you build a society that is more liberty oriented, or more right wing, as I would put it, then women will find that even though they're not getting their security from the state, because the state would be sort of reduced, or at least not be as authoritarian, they will instead find their security in men. And so they're going to be more likely to side with the products of that society, because they will get the security they're looking for. It's just they won't be getting it from the state. They'll get it from their husbands and their families, the men in their families, like their cousins or their brothers or their uncles, etc. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Yes.
Okay. All right. So, I guess those are all the questions I wanted to ask. I mean, we could talk. You made a video that I haven't watched yet called "Why Are Postmodernists Soulless?" I am curious about that. Maybe you can just make a brief comment on that, and then I'll just read the super chats and we'll close it out. So, why are postmodernists soulless?
Postmodernists don't have souls because they don't believe in truth, and truth is one of the components, according to Thomas Aquinas, of and the ability to make sense of the reality of having a soul. So that's the key thing. Whereas for them, reality is just chaos that makes no sense. You can't make sense of anything. Nothing makes any sense. So you're just like an animal, basically. And so therefore, you don't have a soul.
Yeah, I always thought of postmodernism as simply a tool to gain power, because if you can essentially say that there's no such thing as truth, you can make it hard for people to make arguments. And then the truth is that a lot of people who use postmodernism, they don't want to erase truth itself. They want to replace truth with their version of the truth so that they can
and also
become the authority.
It's quite good that other people feel that there's a sense of chaos and nothing makes any sense, because then you can fill the void and take over.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get to define truth because you're the authority. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm going to read your super chats. I got two. One from email address who gives us £5. And he says, would you recommend, Ed, that MRAs go to church to find a trad-based waifu?
What's an MRA?
That's a men's rights advocate. We're not incels. Men's rights activists talk about the sort of legal injustices that disproportionately affect men and things that and they also tend to fight against feminism because feminism is responsible for most of those injustices. Things like, child custody, family courts, divorce, the domestic violence industry, which makes the claim that only men abuse women, the all kinds of circumcision, all kinds of issues that disproportionately affect men and boys.
I would recommend that. Be careful what church you go to, though, because of course the Gnostic heresy that is multiculturalism has become very influential in the more liberal kind of churches. So be very careful, and even in some evangelical churches. So be careful what kind of church you go to. Look into the nature of the church. But in general, yes, you would expect females that were of the pre-industrial kind, the remnant normal population. You would certainly expect them to be churchgoers, and also you will find that church is normally about 2/3 female, and therefore, as a male, there you'll have the pick of the crop.
All right. Dispatcher gives us $2 and says, we need underdogmatism in the parlance of our times. R as in the letter R, as in R-type selection. I don't understand the statement. Do you, by any chance? Underdogmatism in the parlance of our times. No, doesn't ring a bell?
No, I don't understand that.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll just wrap this up here. All right. Well, I that was a lot, and I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us. I know that we went a little bit long. So I do have links to all of your things, all of the places where people can find you in the description. Are there anything you want to plug? Do you have like a new book or a show or something like that?
Well, I have a book. There's my book, Making Sense of Race. There's my book, Churchill's Headmaster, which looks at the school system and whatever. So you might like that. There's my book on Islam, An Evolutionary Perspective. And I've got a book coming out in the summer called Witches, Feminism and the Fall of the West, which might be.
Witches, Feminism, and the Fall of the West.
My channel, The Jolly Heretic, is on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. UK time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Edward Dutton, for coming on today's show. And thank you guys for joining us. If you guys like this video, please hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, hit the bell for notifications, leave us a comment, and also share the video with someone on your social media, wherever you might be, because I do think that these conversations are important and that we should have them and should not fear to have them, because I too am interested in the truth. So thank you again so much for coming on today's show, and we'll talk to you in the next video.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.